So like I said, the title of this chapter is Ecosystems and Their Diversity. And diversity probably is not a new word to you. It's a word that you use in social studies. It's a word that you would have used in previous junior high science courses. It's a pretty common one to discuss. So some of the things that we'll talk about aren't things that are totally new. We're just going to look at them from a different angle, maybe talk about them a little bit differently. So lesson 7 really goes with section 3.1 in your textbook, where we kind of define some of the terms that we're going to use. We talk about what diversity is and why it might exist. And the page numbers are there. You should certainly read the section of your textbook that accompanies this. So we're going to start with definitions and then talk a little bit about diversity after that. So the first thing we're going to go through are these 4 words: ecosystem, community, population, and species. And I put them in this order on purpose. It's not random, it's not alphabetical. There's in order sort of from the thing that is the biggest and the most encompassing to the thing that is the most narrow, to the thing that has the least in its category. So when we're looking at this, we're going from big to small. So the 4 terms that interest us are ecosystem, community, population, and species. Would someone like to tell me what their definition for an ecosystem is? You all have the same one if you wrote it out from your book. Let's see here. Why don't you tell me your ecosystem definition? So, notice how it uses 2 of the words that came from below. It's communities of populations plus all the abiotic factors that surround and influence and affect it. So an ecosystem is the biggest one because it includes the terms that come below it in the list. Now we will discuss what abiotic factors are and examples of how they affect things in their ecosystem. But for now, let me just remind you, when a word starts with A, it means not, and biotic means living, so abiotic means not living. Let's move down to community, since it was part of the definition of ecosystem. Would someone like to share their community definition? All right, then oh yes, thank you, volunteers. So, organisms or populations interacting in a given area. So I'm just writing the key terms here. Notice how we're taking the thing that comes below, the population, or even the organisms, the species, and we're saying that they're interacting, which is key, and that they're in a given area. That is important. Things cannot be in a community if they are not in the same physical area. So for example, Okotoks is a community because there are a bunch of populations of organisms living in the same area. We are one of the populations, but there are certainly other organisms like dandelions, for example, which probably outnumber us 1 million to 1 at this point in the year. Bugs, insects, birds, deer, coyotes. What else do I see a lot of? Magpies. I almost hit one this morning on the road eating some garbage. Community. Let's move down to population. Would someone like to share their population definition? All right. Eeny, meeny, miny. Oh, volunteer. Rebecca, yeah. So, a population sounds kind of like a community, except we're not saying that there are different populations, different organisms. We're saying individuals of the same species that live in the same geographical area, so the same place, at the same time. So you are not in a population with people who live in Germany right now because they do not live in the same place at the same time as you. You are members of the same species, but you are not members of the same population. If you happen to live in the Okotoks area, then you are members of the same population. You live in the same place at the same time. Now, if we move down to species, would someone like to share their species definition? Let's pick someone from the back row. All right, go for it. Species. You don't have it yet? Matt, do you have species yet? Okay, go. So, the key thing here is that if you are members of the same species, you could interbreed and your offspring, so babies, would be fertile as well. That's barring any sort of complication that might prevent that, but in a typical scenario, the offspring that are produced are also capable of continuing the reproductive cycle. This would rule out sometimes hybrid organisms, like a horse and a donkey make a mule, but mules generally are not fertile. And so we're getting in this gray area of whether things are just a subcategory of an existing species or their own species. So that you know, I'm not going to force that tiny specific detail as a point of contention. Is something a species or is it not? We just wanted a good description for what makes a species. And generally, it's that they can reproduce together and their offspring can also reproduce. So these words, these 4 words, we will use throughout this chapter and throughout the next chapter as well. So it's not important to only to be able to define them, but if I were to say the word community, that you can apply it and you can understand what it means to be a community. For example, something I might ask you to do on, say, quest at the end of chapter 3 is I would describe a scenario to you and then ask you, okay, based on what you've read, what is the community or what is the population that's being described? So you can't just know the definition, you have to understand what it means and be able to apply that to an actual situation. So we'll do some questions in your textbook to help you practice that as well. Does anyone want to ask any questions right here? So I have some pictures here only because I like to have something to point to when we talk about ecosystem diversity. There are lots of types of ecosystems. Depending on how specific we'd like to be, we can talk about, the 8 or 9 great biomes that exist on the planet, or we could talk about 37 different types of ecosystems, or within each of those, we can talk about dozens and dozens of little subcategories. I do not need you at any point to memorize the names of all of the ecosystems. I need you to understand that there are things that make ecosystems unique and that there is variation within ecosystems. So those 2 points are the overarching theme that we're getting at here. So ecosystems, which is everything that lives there and all of the biotic and abiotic factors interacting. Obviously, because there's so many things, there can be lots of different types. So I chose 3 here. There is a forest, just your typical average forest, like the ones that we would see around here. There is shallow or fresh water here, kind of like what you might see in a lake or a pond. And there is salt, or we want to say deep ocean water here, slightly different. These are just 3 examples of ecosystems that exist. There are many more besides this. They're just the ones that I'd like to use. In each of these ecosystems, there are different layers or different levels or different sections. For example, in the forest, we could divide it into sort of 3 sections. The upper canopy, that's what it's called, that would be like the tallest trees, the ones that you could see if you were flying over the forest in a helicopter or an airplane. Then you would see sort of the middle layer where it's really dense. This would be things that come up off the ground, but they're not excessively tall, and they're probably shaded or shadowed a little bit by the upper canopy that's there. But there's lots and lots of plants and organisms in that level. Then what exists on the floor, on the ground? I could keep dividing this further. I could divide it meter by meter or centimeter by centimeter, really, if I wanted to. But those are three basic layers that you would see in a typical forest. And each of them is different. There is variation within the forest. So when we're talking about ecosystems, you have to remember that just because organisms live in the same place, the forest, doesn't actually mean that they live in the exact same conditions. There might be variation in the forest, so much so that being higher up or lower down gives you different characteristics, gives you different abiotic conditions that could affect survival. So if we talk about the upper canopy, we would say things like, well, that gets a lot of sun, for sure. As compared to that lower layer, we would say there is very little sun. So we would continue to focus on energy and where energy is available. We would also think about matter and what kind of matter is cycling. And so I might say, yes, the top gets a lot of sun, but there would be very little, or perhaps no, decomposition going on way up there in the tops of trees. But down here on the soil, there would very probably be a lot of decomposition happening. And so this is just an example to try to illustrate that energy and matter, which we discussed previously, cycle differently in different ecosystems and different parts of ecosystems. Now, if we compare some of the areas that exist in water, we could see similar things happening with matter and energy. For example, in shallow or fresh water, there is a section that's close to land. It's called the littoral zone. Kind of sounds like the word littering. That's not what it means, though. It's the section where sun is very probably going to be able to access something that's growing on the floor of the waterbed. So in this section, we would very probably have a lot of sun, as compared to over here, as we get a little bit deeper. Sun is very probably not going to be able to access producers that are on the bottom as easily as it did in the shallow section. So we don't want to say no sun, but probably less sun, because we're talking about shallow water here. And in shallow water, usually the sun can reach the floor even if it gets a little bit deeper. If we compare that with the saltwater or deep ocean scenario, there's certainly a portion that's closer to shore where there would be a decent amount of sun, probably similar to the deep portion of our pond. But when we get out to the open ocean and we get somewhere down here where we've gone down deep into a trench, maybe into an abyss in the ocean floor, there would be little or no sun. And that might be a place where we might consider thinking about chemosynthetic organisms that might be producers based on heat and sulfur coming from geothermal vents instead of from the sun. Now, if we're talking about water in terms of decomposition, we would follow a similar pattern. There would probably be more decomposition the closer you are to shore because there are more organisms living there. And the farther you go out, there would be less. And when you get really, really deep, there would be little or no decomposition going on as well because there's not very many organisms that exist in that really deep part of the ocean. Now, I focused on sun and decomposition because they summed up energy and matter very nicely, but we could be more specific about exactly what type of matter there is. Maybe in some areas there's lots of nitrogen, but not a lot of phosphorus, or a lot of water, but not a lot of carbon and oxygen cycling. So I was being very generic here by just mentioning decomposition. Now, the reason that those three pictures, the forest, the shallow and freshwater, and the deep salt water, are different ecosystems is because they have distinctive characteristics. There are things about them that are different that make different organisms capable of living there. Some of the characteristics are biotic ones. And like we've mentioned before, biotic is referring to things that are living. Abiotic would be referring to things that are non-living. So some of the things that would be different in terms of biotic characteristics of those environments would have to do with the type of organism that's there. So for example, the type of producer. So I said that in the deep ocean water, we're very likely going to run into different types of producers, ones that rely on chemosynthesis instead of ones that rely on photosynthesis. We could be looking at not just type of producer, we could also look at number of producers. So not just how many are there, but what kind are there. We could look at the type or the number of decomposers, because decomposition is a key factor in the cycling of nutrients, and producers are a key factor in how energy makes its way into a food chain. We could also look at the type and number of consumers. And then remember that when we discussed consumers, there were a whole bunch of subcategories. So when I say type, I mean things like, are they primary or secondary or tertiary? This is where we could talk about scavengers and detrivores and herbivores and carnivores and all of those little sub-definitions of types of consumers that exist. Essentially, I mentioned each of the three basic trophic levels. So when we talk about the biotic characteristics of an ecosystem, we mean at each trophic level, how many organisms are there and of what type? The other thing that's important to talk about when we think about biotic characteristics that I'll represent with little arrows is how are these organisms interacting with each other? One of the descriptions in the definitions was that it's not just organisms, but it's organisms who interact with each other. And sometimes the interaction of organisms causes differences in the ecosystem. So it could be interactions that are helpful, like a mutualistic relationship where they both benefit. It could be something parasitic. It could be predator and prey. But there are lots of interactions that exist between organisms. And all of this would be considered biotic characteristics. Now, I'm being very general here. When I ask you questions about biotic and abiotic characteristics, I will want you to provide examples of that. So when I say type and number of producer, if I give you a particular ecosystem, tell me what kind of producer is there. That would be a biotic characteristic. I also want to make a note just in here, even though I know that you know that humans are living, I just want to remind you, we, us, humans, are often a biotic characteristic in a lot of ecosystems. We have a huge impact. Now on the non-living side, we want to focus on energy and matter. So for example, are we talking about sun and photosynthesis? Are we talking about chemosynthesis? What about the water that's available? What about carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus? So all of the cycles of matter that we discussed before. Are there other types of matter that are important in this ecosystem besides one of the four that we mentioned? When we talk about energy and matter, for both of them, we could talk about things like quantity, so how much is there, but also quality. For example, there might be a lot of water in a particular ecosystem, but if it's all polluted, it's not very high quality and probably not very useful for the organisms that are living there. Now, someone asked me this, oh, one of the first times I taught this, and so I decided this is where we had to put it. Technically, a virus is not a living organism. Technically, it's not because it requires a host. There's reasons that it's not considered living. And so if you wanted to use a virus as an example, it would technically have to go into this abiotic section because technically it is not alive. However, uh, a virus needs a host, and if you mention the host, you can put it on the living side. So I just wanted to mention that because it's something that people usually think of. Does anyone want to ask any questions right away? So this is our very basic general overview of what biotic and abiotic characteristics should entail. Now we're going to move and look at some specific organisms so that we can start generating real examples of what this might look like in a particular ecosystem. So this is where you're going to need your textbook on page 78. All right, so we'll start at the top with the pronghorns, and I'd like to hear some examples of biotic factors that would be part of a pronghorn's ecosystem. Yes, producers. So we could talk about what kind of producers there are, how many producers there are. So whether or not producers are present and available would affect the pronghorn's survival. Does someone else want to suggest another biotic factor in their environment? Let's go, oh, eeny, meeny, why don't you tell me one of yours? Okay, I'll ask you again on another one. You go. Predators. Now, we could be talking about a predator of the pronghorn themselves, for sure. Something that is chasing them or hunting them or eating them. That could include us. But we could also talk about how predators might affect the availability of the producers that are there. So remember that it doesn't have to be something that is directly affecting the organism. It could be affecting something else that they need to survive. Does anyone want to suggest a third one for the pronghorns? Yeah. Ooh, scavengers. Now, how would scavengers affect the pronghorns? Did you have an idea in mind when you said that? Yeah. Right. Matter has to continuously cycle, and so scavengers could actually be helpful in helping the cycling of matter continue with all of those different cycles, with carbon, with oxygen, with phosphorus, with nitrogen. Uh, let's move into the biotic category for humans. So we'll do all the biotic ones first. We've already said producers, predators, and scavengers, so let's not repeat them. What are some other different ideas that don't include one of those? Yeah, Logan. Yeah. Other humans. Now, there's a lot of reasons other humans could affect your survival, but let's focus on the most basic one, competition for resources. If there is a limited amount of resources and there is more than one of you trying to obtain them, then things are going to go to one and probably not to the other. Now, why don't you guys tell me your other human example? Yeah. So, we could apply this to other organisms as well. Either they're in competition with other members of their species for resources, or they might be actually physically attacking and consuming the other members of their species. There are lots of animal species where this could occur. So could you be more specific? Like, do you mean like a number of things that are, okay. So we'll talk about here number of offspring or how much reproduction is happening. That's a biotic characteristic of an environment. If we talk about starfish now, I saw lots of people trying to look up starfish because they were like, I don't really know a lot about starfish. What are some of your examples of biotic factors for starfish? Yeah, go. Oh, she said the coral reef. Remember, coral is living, hey? It's not just a rock. I know some people think that's what it is. It's little polyps. They grow. They have bacteria and algae that are living within them that they live in concert with. So the coral reef could certainly be one. Yes, Brad. So, seagulls. Let's talk about this. Seagulls are probably not eating starfish directly. They might, I don't know. But seagulls are probably in competition with starfish for things. Seagulls could be, for example, contributing to the cycling of matter because they are constantly in and out of the water, consuming things, probably leaving waste behind. Did you have a specific idea about seagulls? Oh, you know what? I don't know if they do. I, they probably can. I don't know that I've ever seen one eat a starfish, but I don't see why it couldn't. Does it happen in Finding Nemo? Finding Nemo is usually my reference for anything that happens in the ocean. Uh, does anyone else have another starfish example? Yeah? Bacteria could certainly be part of that. And like I mentioned with my human example, bacteria can be good or they can be bad. It depends. They might be a pathogen that's carrying a disease, or they might be helpful intestinal flora that's helping digestive processes happen. Let's move to the abiotic side now and talk about pronghorns. Would anyone like to share their example for abiotic for pronghorns? Yeah. So, I'm going to use that as actually two different categories. Pollution is really general, so I'm going to specify pollution of the air and pollution of the water because both of them could be completely separate but completely important abiotic factors in their environment. Does anyone want to suggest another one? Yeah. I like that. And what was your idea? What was your idea with gravity? Like, did you have a specific thing in mind? Oh, okay, sure. No, I just wondered if maybe you thought, oh, if there was no gravity, you know, things wouldn't fall and then they wouldn't have food sources or something like that. Okay, sure. Sunlight could certainly be one of them. Now, let's remind ourselves, sunlight is probably not directly affecting the pronghorn. They probably don't require, they're not photosynthetic pronghorns, but they eat things that are photosynthetic. And so even if, and I was telling some people at the back there, even if you only ate meat, and you might think, no, photosynthesis doesn't affect me, it does, because at some point the thing that you ate a plant. So even if you are not consuming a single fruit or vegetable and you think photosynthesis is not part of your life, it is. It certainly is. Let's move on to humans. What are some of your human examples? Yeah. Water. And so we could add things like water temperature. That's important. We could talk about water quality. We could talk about water quantity. Yes. I like it. Now, we're getting a little bit beyond ecosystem here, but it's certainly not living and it's certainly affecting our survival. Yep. So let's talk about disasters. Something like a forest fire or a tornado or a hurricane or a tsunami, all of those would be abiotic factors affecting human survival.